So I'm going to introduce, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Marcia Carlson. Professor Carlson is a family demographer whose work examines the linkages between family context and the well-being of children and adolescents. Her recent work on changing patterns of parenthood and family complexity has been widely influential for social scientists interested in family inequality and has offered key insights to the design and implementation of family policy. Not surprisingly, she has published widely in prestigious journals in family, demography, and general social science, such as the Journal of Marriage and Family, Demography, and the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. She's currently professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin at Madison and the director of its acclaimed Center for Demography and Ecology. And in addition to all of this, Professor Carlson is currently serving as the Vice President of the Population Association of America. She's treasurer of the Association for Population Centers, and she's the chair of the Board of Overseers of the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, here is Dr. Marcia Carlson.
Okay, thank you so much. That's such a kind and generous introduction. It's a delight to be with you all this afternoon. Thank you so much for coming online for this seminar. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, did that work? Did everyone see it? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, it's really a treat to be here, and I'm just honored to be part of this seminar. Thank you, Kate, for inviting me, and Leah for all your help getting things set up. So today I'm going to talk about families, and knowing that this is an interdisciplinary audience, I am going to keep it sort of on general terms about kind of what's going on, what I think about what's going on, and what I think it means, and then how we think about it for public policy. So here's what I'm hoping we're going to go through, talking about families as a social institution. What do they do? What is their role? How are families changing? Families as a nexus or a center of inequality, and then what could be public policy responses. And I look forward to conversation at the end. I know a little bit about Canadian social policy from the work of Rachel and others, but I frankly don't know as much as I should, so I look forward to hearing what you all have to say as well at the end. When we think about families as a social institution, we think about a couple of things, right? So families provide a context for human development, what's sometimes called the accident of birth, right? You don't choose your parents or the family into which you're born, and frankly, your parents don't choose the kid, right? There's probably some genetic endowments that, and other things that influence who that child is going to become, but those of us who are parents realize, you don't really know how it's all going to play out, and yet we have this kind of social role for families that are supposed to care for the next generation. Okay, so, oops. So when we think about what families do, right, they provide this context for human development. Physical care from the very beginning is really fundamental, right? Babies are profoundly dependent, would not last very long without human care and attention. Families provide socialization about how the world works and kind of how to be a member of a society. And then, of course, they support physical, emotional, cognitive, behavioral development, right, that ideally leads to kind of independence over time. And so families have to make a lot of investments in children over a very long period of dependency, right? And those of you who study the transition to adulthood might know that this period has gotten longer, right? We expect families to do more for a longer period of time before they're going to be kind of launched into the world, because they're going to be launched. And so the goal really of families, right, this kind of kin network, is for children to become, quote, successful, right? That could mean lots of different things, but when we think about the societal level, we might think about workers, community members, taxpayers, and so forth. And so really societies, I would say, benefit from what you might call, free labor that families provide in caring for children, and also for elders. That's not the focus of this particular talk, but families do a lot, right, of kind of care work to raise the next generation and to care for the earlier generation. And so you could find a lot of quotes about children. One I pulled here is just the future of any society depends on its ability to foster the health and well-being of the next generation. That came from the National Center for Scientific Council on the Developing Child in 2007. And so families are important, right? I think they play an important role in kind of the intergenerational transmission of lots of things, ideally rearing kids effectively, and yet they're changing quite dramatically. And so I'm just going to go over some of the changes. I won't be able to cover everything, but to highlight some major changes in the last 50 to 100 years with respect to fertility, marriage, cohabitation, divorce, and non-marital birth. There we go. Okay. Okay, fertility. The U.S. fertility rate is shown here in terms of total fertility rate. The replacement rate for populations is about 2.1, right? So on average, populations are going to remain stable. If every woman or every couple has about 2.1 children, that rate obviously went up a lot during the baby boom in the middle of the 20th century, went back down, and now we're at about 1.7, so below replacement, which is somewhat unique in the US, except for that kind of dip earlier in the 70s. I looked at the Canadian total fertility rate, similar pattern, you will know this, I'm sure, right? So a high number of average births in the 50s and 60s, and now it seems that your fertility rate is about, TFR is about 1.5 in 2019. And so these are really record low fertility rates. On the left, you can see a piece from, I think, US News and World Report showing US births continue to fall, fertility rate hits record low. On the right, Canada sees record low fertility rates. And I was struck by the fact that the article there mentioned specifically that, yes, fertility is low, and therefore we're going to have higher immigration admissions per year, which is very different from the US, right? I'm sure you may have heard about some of our challenges, right, in terms of immigration right now. So that was an interesting difference that jumped out at me. Fertility rates low, right, bottom line. Also, a big change has been the age at which people get married. Still today, most people are going to enter marriage at some point, but the age when that happens has gotten quite a bit older. So by US standards, it's pretty fun to have data going all the way back to 1890. And so you can see there that for men and for women, it was about 26 and a half and 23 and a half, respectively. The average age that someone entered into marriage, it went down very dramatically in the middle of the 20th century. My mom got married at age 19 in the 50s, and then it's gone up dramatically ever since. So today we're marrying on average much later than any time in the recent history. It doesn't mean, though, that people aren't forming unions. And so many people, their first union that they enter will be a cohabiting union. So you can see here that the fraction of people entering a cohabiting union has gone up very dramatically since the 1960s. These are marriage cohorts, so people entering marriage. In the late 1960s to early 70s, it was only about 11% of individuals cohabited. These are women cohabited before marriage, and it's gone up to about 3/4 in the most recent marriage data that we have. So it's a very common experience, right, to live together with someone before you become legally married. And then the divorce rate has also seen a really big change. And so going from here, the 1900s, kind of bounced around a little bit, dramatic increase then in the 70s, up to about 1980, and then has declined ever since then. And so it's reached a 40-year low in 2018. And, it's still a non-trivial number of divorces, but marriages on average have gotten more stable. And that's related to the fact that people are marrying later, right? Because oftentimes people will finish their education, get a job, then find a partner, and you tend to make better matches, all else equal, when you marry later. So that's not independent of the age of marriage. I found some Canadian data by Rachel there, Margolis, looking also at the Canadian versus US divorce rates, right? And it seems that there's been, the level is much lower. It seems about half of what the US has, but there's been a slight dropping off in terms of Canada and along with the US, right? So divorce rates are relatively high, especially in the US, but have been going down a little bit in recent periods. Another big change that we've seen is the rise in births outside of marriage. So you can see here I put an arrow for the US and Canada. And Overall, it's about, at least as of 2010, was about 40 to 41% of births occurring outside of marriage in the US and Canada. You can see compared to other OECD countries, some of them are quite a bit higher, right? So Iceland is about 2/3, Sweden, Norway, over half, France, and so forth. So really a dramatic change. And again, these things aren't unrelated, right? In terms of people marrying later, it's more likely then that you would end up having a birth before marriage, but a large fraction of births today occur outside of legal marriage. And we also have noticed that in cross-national context as well, and I'm sorry there's not Canadian data on this particular paper and slide, but you can see here that many marriages are going to break up before kids reach age 15, and even a higher fraction of cohabiting unions. And so the blue is showing you the proportion of marriages or parents who were married at the time of a birth who dissolve that union by the time the child is 15, and the orange bar is cohabitation. So you can see that in all the countries, cohabiting relationships are much more likely to break up compared to marriages. You can also see that some countries have really high dissolution rates, right, of which the US is one. So the vast majority of cohabiting unions are going to break up before the child reaches 15. And that's not the same in every country. You can see, for example, Germany, it's about 1/3, Netherlands, about 1/5, Norway, about 1/3, right? So it's much lower in many places, but there's a pretty consistent difference between marriage and cohabitation in the likelihood of breaking up. And just as a sidelight, when parents repartner, it's not uncommon to have children by more than one partner. And so this is from a paper a few years ago, comparing 4 countries that we had data on: Australia, Norway, Sweden, and the United States. And the blue line is showing all mothers, so anyone that has at least one child, what's the fraction of those mothers that have a child with 2 or more fathers? And it's usually 2, it's not usually more than 2, but so more than one partner. It's about 12% in Australia, 16 in Norway, 13 in Sweden, and 23 in the US. So when you have children, it's not uncommon to have those with more than one partner. Not the majority, but it's not 0. And then of course you can only have kids with more than one partner if you have at least 2 kids. So when we limit it to that particular group, you can see that in the US it's about 1/3 of women or mothers that have 2 or more children have those with 2 different partners, 2 or more different partners. So you can, pulling this all together, you can see that there's a bit of a disconnection, growing disconnection between marriage and childbearing and child rearing. There's a rise in single parenthood, right? Not everyone will partner. There's a rise in step families as people do repartner, and there's growing family complexity across all of these patterns taken together. So you end up having more families that are spanning households, right? You might have a non-resident father, you might have parents co-parenting across households after their unions end. What one very well-known family scholar, Frank Furstenberg, has called from consensus to complexity. So if I could go back and show you kind of where things were at an earlier time frame, there was more similarity across families. Although it's been pointed out that if we use the middle of the 20th century, we're probably over giving too much credit to consensus, right? Because there's more variation, and that was a kind of unique period of a lot of homogeneity in families. Nevertheless, there's been a lot of change, a lot of growing difference. And so then when we put all these patterns together, we can begin to think about children and what kind of living arrangements kids experience. And this is data, again, for the US. We can see, going back to 1960, it was the majority of kids were living with 2 parents, nearly 90%. And it was steadily declining since the 1960s amidst some of these family changes. So today it's about 70% of kids are living with 2 parents. And the line that's offsetting that is really the single mother line of living with a mother only. The father only line has gone up, to some extent, but it's at a very low base. And living with no parents, which would be in a foster care or other situation, grandparents or something, has also gone up a little bit, but from a low base. So much of what's happened is the rise in family instability, a rise in single parents. Here we're not able in this kind of figure to look at shared custody when parents parent together. In fact, there's not great data on that that I'm familiar with, but it's kind of getting living arrangements at a particular point in time. And just for fun, I found the Canadian data from Statistics Canada, and it seems like the pattern isn't dramatically different. Right? So a much higher fraction, this is actually breaking down by married parents or common law parents, high fraction with married parents in the earlier years, and then kind of more fanning out or more variation over time period. So those are some kind of basic trends, right? Kind of a whirlwind tour about family patterns and what's been going on. We can also, or it's important to identify as well, that this is not all happening evenly across the socioeconomic distribution across all families. And so there's been really important differences observed by socioeconomic status in the family demography itself, the nature of these patterns, and then in kind of family processes and how families play out, and then in child outcomes. So I'm going to spend more of the time talking about the differences in family demography and the child outcomes by socioeconomic status. There's a lot of literature on, some growing literature on family processes and kind of different parenting and parental investments by family structure and by SES, but I'm going to focus a little bit less on. So if we think about the demography, the inequality in demographic patterns, there's really strong evidence of growing inequality in family demography, or what Sarah McClanahan was really the first to, I think, identify this, called diverging destinies of children's experiences. She gave an presidential address at the Population Association of America annual meetings, where she highlighted patterns for kids' experiences of families and how those were growing in the gap between high and low socioeconomic status families was growing. And so a lot of literature has followed on since that time in the last 15 or 16 years. And there's been quite a bit of evidence about differences by socioeconomic status, often measured by education in marriage, childbearing, divorce, and family stability. So I'll just give you a few examples of that socioeconomic difference. So here's one figure on the percent of women who are married by education from 1940 to 2018 in the United States. You can see that over on the left side, there's quite a bit of similarity. So here women are divided into 4 education categories: less than high school or GED, some college, or bachelor's degree. So they weren't exactly the same, but there's a difference from 53 to 63%, right? So a 10 percentage point difference. And actually the most educated in 1940 were the least likely to be currently married. This is straight cross-section of who's married at a given time. And then you can see time marches on, there's this crossover and a growing gap. So today, in most recent data, 2018, about 59% of women with a bachelor's degree are currently married, compared to 27% of those with less than high school education. So there's a lot going on behind this slide, right? There's been a huge increase in education. The group with very low education is increasingly selective, in the sense that it's a small minority. I think about 12% people don't end up getting at least a high school degree, but you can see this kind of fanning out, and the higher likelihood of marriage among those with the most education, right? So exactly those women or people who could choose to not be married because they probably have socioeconomic resources that allow them not to necessarily feel as compelled to partner, are the ones choosing to marry. Education is also linked to the age at which you have children. So I had mentioned that the age of marriage is going up. So you won't be surprised to see that the age when people have kids is also going up, right? Because many of those delays in marriage are because of getting education, or because of wanting to kind of find your career path, get on that path before then finding a partner and getting married. And so many people, especially in higher education, want to get married before they have a child. And so that all takes time, right? So here you can look, if you just look on the right side, you can see the median age that mothers have their first child, or median age at first birth, by educational attainment. So for those with a master's degree or higher, it's about 30 years on average, bachelor's degree 28, some college 25, and high school or less 24. Right, so very different, 6 years of difference in terms of when women typically start having kids. And obviously underneath education, especially in the United States, is a very tight link to occupation and earnings, right? So those who have higher education are much more likely to have a job that pays a higher wage and higher average earnings and average income. And you can see there the bars kind of divided into particular age groups. So for the low educated, you know, it's not that they're zero having kids older, but it's much more likely to be at a younger age. And then education, at least in the US, is linked to marital stability. So college-educated women, as it says here, are more likely to have longer-lasting marriages. So this is the probability that a first marriage will survive at least 20 years among women. So it's about half of all marriages will last for 20 years, but you can see in the lower set of bars, it's much more likely for women with at least a bachelor's degree. So 78% will last for 20 years compared to about 40% of those who are high school or less. I should say, if there's any clarifying questions, feel free to stop me. I know demographers love data, right? So I'm going through a lot of data and slides, but feel free to interject if there's something confusing. So another difference that has been observed is non-marital childbearing by education. So you can see here that this is mother's education or women's education, right? So at the very bottom, we have those with more than a bachelor's degree. Bachelor's degree or plus, it should actually say. The middle is some college, and the top is high school or less. And you can see there's a really big difference. So those with college degrees are very unlikely to have a child outside of marriage, whereas about half of those with a high school degree or less are having a child outside of marriage. So taking these things together, right, these kind of pieces, big changes in families, inequality in those changes and how they play out, we can then look at this inequality of children's experiences of living with two biological parents. And this is some work that I'm doing with a couple of colleagues using data from the Generations Gender Survey. We've divided education similarly into high school or less is low, some college, and a college or tertiary degree or higher here. And so you can see that this is the average number of years that kids will live with both of their biological parents from birth by these three categories of mother's education. And so you can see that across this group of countries for which we had data, there's a gradient, right? It's sloping up from the left to the right. So the more education that a mother has, the longer the children are going to live with both parents, or the longer that relationship is going to last with the biological parent. So in every case, there is a socioeconomic gradient. You can see that for the US on the right, the gradient is the largest, right? That there's the biggest gap between these three bars, and there's also the lowest overall levels. So the sort of higher union dissolution here in the US leads to more instability for kids and a bigger socioeconomic gradient. So here, just to highlight the gap, you can see that children in the US with highly educated mothers, they spend about 4 more years with both biological parents compared to those with less educated mothers. And the gap in almost every other country is about 2 years. So there's more inequality. Not surprising for those who might study the US, we have inequality in many different things, and there's more inequality in families than in these other countries for which we have data here. So when we think then about socioeconomic inequality in family processes and outcomes, there's a lot of growing literature on family structure change and that instability and how it is related to children's outcomes. And there's this literature started in the 1980s, has gone on for 40 some years. And in general, I would say that all else equal, there's an association that family structure change and instability are linked with lower economic resources, which isn't surprising, right? If you have 2 earners in a home versus 1, you're more likely to have a higher level of income and earnings, and then less consistent or involved parenting. Again, all else equal, and I think that's also very different by socioeconomic status in terms of how parenting after union dissolution plays out. And I'm doing some work with colleagues here to think about shared custody, shared parenting, and that's a really important piece, I think, of how families are changing. It's not something I'm going to focus on here. But when we think about families, there's a lot of difference across different family structures. And we know, all else equal, that socioeconomic disadvantage is shown to diminish children's well-being, right? And so when we think of our societal lens, right, we think of what families do and kind of what they're able to do, and we can see that not all kids are able to get a high level of socioeconomic economic resources, right? And so then we might be concerned about what does that mean for children's well-being. So this is just one slide I pulled out from the US. There's some cross-national data on this too, right? But not surprisingly, poverty is much higher in unmarried parent families. So this is by, this is the US poverty definition. It's about 40% of unmarried mother families are poor compared to 8% of married couple families, right? So there's a much higher likelihood of poverty with a single parent family. So we could pull out some different aspects of child well-being and look at how those vary across socioeconomic status. And so there's been a lot of attention in the US, so thinking about school readiness, right? And what do kids have when they begin formal education? And I think this is such an interesting outcome to look at, because if you think about what's happening for kids in the first, say, 5 or 6 years of life, so much of that revolves around families, right? And so obviously once you enter formal school, you're interacting with other institutions, and those might be obviating or increasing inequality. We hope reducing inequality. But when you think about what kids experience in the beginning part of life, family is really fundamental to that. So I think when we see gaps that are already in place at a very young level as kids enter school, it points us to think about what's going on with families and how that might differ across family groups. And so here, this is just some data on some school readiness outcomes. So recognizing all of your letters, counting to 20 or higher, being able to write your name, reading words in a book, right? And we might think, okay, maybe this doesn't really matter. We're putting too much pressure on kids when they're young. That's a whole other conversation. But to the extent that these are things that seem to predict kind of doing well in school and longer term success, we might worry how they vary by socioeconomic status. So here we have 5 categories of education. Less than high school is the blue on the left. High school or equivalent is the green. Blue is vocational education or college. Orange is bachelor's degree, and then the darker blue is graduate degree. And you can see that for all of these, there's a notable gradient, right? So for those with very low educated parents, only about 15% know their letters by the time they enter. I'm sorry, this is kids age 3 to 6 actually. So it does include kids before they've entered school, but this kind of group. And of course, you're going to be moving along in that as you move from age 3 to 6. But sort of taking the whole, you see this pretty striking socioeconomic gradient across all of these different measures. And there's, differences. There's literature on parenting and how that plays out. And one thing that people have found is that kids who have in a lower socioeconomic status, their parents spend less time reading to them in terms of literacy related activities. And so this is showing kids ages 0 to 2, 3 to 5, and 6 and older across the 3 sets of bars. And this is by income quintile, using some data from the PSID. So the lowest, taking the income distribution, dividing it into 5 different groups, you can see that the lowest quintile is the blue, is the lowest at each particular point. So as compared to the highest quintile, on average, are spending less time reading to kids, about an hour less or an hour and a half less older compared to those at the highest economic quintile. And the only place where there's not a difference, it seems like between quintiles, in the first one, in terms of very young kids, the difference is really at the top and the bottom. As you move along, there's more differences by age 6 and older between the bottom 3 quintiles compared to the top quintile, right? So kids in different kinds or with different socioeconomic status families are getting kind of different inputs into their literacy in this particular case. Here's another example, again, focusing on these kind of preschool gaps. This is for kids, gaps in vocabulary between kids from low and high income homes. Here's data from the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia. So these typical sort of liberal welfare state countries. And as you can see on the right, the summary in the US and the UK, there are larger school readiness gaps among 4 and 5-year-olds. And this is, again, comparing sort of months of development in terms of what you can measure of kids' kind of capabilities as a function of high income versus low income families. And so it says here in the UK, the gap is about 19 months, in Australia, 14 and a half months, in Canada, where you are about 11 months. So again, this kind of persistent difference at very young ages by family socioeconomic status. And then some of you may be familiar with famous Nobel Prize winning economist James Heckman, who's done a lot of work on early early child outcomes and the importance of early investment and how it really pays off to invest young, and that has more benefit than investing in older kids. And I think one very striking piece of evidence that he uses is this figure that from his science piece in 2006 that looks at, again, these starting gaps at age 6 by, these are quartiles of income, so taking fourths of income. And you can see that as kids move across school age, those gaps are not diminished, right? And so again, by the time kids are age 6, kind of starting their schooling, there's already a large percentile gap. These are math achievement scores. And those gaps don't change, right? And it's a lot to expect a school system to kind of bring that down when it's the same, kids are often in the same context, the same neighborhood, the same families, and so forth. And then in the schools, it's very challenging then to reduce those particular gaps. And so I think the persistence of these early differences are very striking, and I think point to, right, his point about early investment. And in my view, when we think about early investment, we have to think about families, right? Because families are the social institution that kids start out in, right? And so another piece of evidence, this is from some of my colleagues, Bobby Wolf and Seth Pollack and several others, have found that there's an association in kids' actual brain size by socioeconomic status. So if you look at children as they develop in months, those with higher SES parents end up having sort of larger brain size and larger brain capacity. And I think this kind of evidence is really striking because it takes it away from kind of what are parents doing or not doing, but what are kids getting, right? Because, a kid can't really be responsible, right, for their own kind of brain development. It's kind of a very biologic measure of outcome. And the fact that there's a socioeconomic difference in this measure, I think, is very notable. And I think this particular group is going on to also look at adolescence to see kind of how it plays out. So bottom line, there's a lot of differences in kids, and these are just a few examples. I could give you a lot more examples of kids' outcomes that vary by poverty status or by socioeconomic status. So we might then think about public policy, right? So if we're thinking of, it's this luck of the draw in terms of what family one is born into, and we might think about the rationale for social justice in terms of giving kids a chance, and public policy then can redistribute resources in a way that helps bring up kids that don't have the same opportunities as those from higher SES status. And so disadvantaged families overall must rely more heavily on the safety net, but at least in the US, benefit levels have been historically low, especially in cross-national contexts. And another side point, I've done some other work on this, is that many public policies, at least here, are not very well suited to unstable or complex families, right? So we often have policies that assume 0-1 about certain statuses, right? As a kid living in one place versus another, to the extent that parents are sharing across households, our policies don't often do that very well. You have to claim that one custodial parent. So that's a whole other conversation. But when we think then about public spending, this is some OECD data going from 1960 to 1990 to 2016. The public social spending, the percent of GDP that's spent on public social spending across these different countries. So the average is about 21%, the orange bar. You can see the US and Canada also farther out on the right compared to other countries on the left. France, Finland, Belgium, Italy, Denmark, that spend a higher share of their GDP on public social spending. And this matters for poverty, right? So this is some data from, again, from OECD, looking at what happens to poverty rates. These are relative poverty rates, which is about less than half of the median or average income. And you can see here that, and I always find this data very striking, especially when I teach my students. They're very struck by the fact that it's not that the before tax and transfer poverty rates are that different, right? If you think about what people earn from the marketplace, those numbers do vary, right? So you've got Finland at 18%, or France at 31%. So there is some variation, but in general, the blue bars are notable, right? It's a high fraction. These are family poverty rates. a high fraction of people that would be poor by just their market income, what they can get from their job or their earnings, right? But what really differentiates countries is how much that bar is moved, right? So how the blue bar shrinks to the red bar. So after taxes and transfers, Denmark, for example, at the top starts out at 24%, goes down to 5%. Sweden, similar, 27 down to 5%, and so forth. And you can see that how much countries reduce poverty rate. Poverty rates varies a lot, with the US at the bottom going from 26 only down to 17%, and Canada is a few bars up, going from 23% down to 12%. And so I think that's where public policy comes in, right? Is what are we doing to alleviate or to remove the disadvantage or the lack of resources that people get in the marketplace. And this is some data specifically focused on children from Tim's meeting and Olivia Teveno. Tim happens to be my husband, so it's always fun to talk about his work. So here they're looking at child poverty across different countries, right? Again, using OECD data. And you can see here that the length of the bar is how much poverty is reduced as a function of policies, right? So you can see Norway here, child poverty starts out somewhat lower, is reduced to about 5%. Germany down to 20, down to about 7. So there's some difference compared to the overall poverty rate, but you can see where countries end up on the triangle at the bottom, and the US doesn't end up very well, right? We end up at about 20%. Canada, you're a little bit better, it looks like about 15%. And so this is the role of policy, right, of thinking about what can be done. So we had a big policy change that happened here in the US, the American Rescue Plan, right? There's going to be a lot of money going into families, right? A lot of this is obviously motivated by the pandemic and the job loss and the, so many things that families are suffering with now. And it's a lot in this particular package, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but just to show you, it's 1.9 trillion American dollars, and there's a lot of different components here. Thinking about children, right, one of the main things is the child tax benefits that are now going to be refundable and at a much higher level. So families can get up to, I believe it's $3,600 for a child less than 6, $3,000 for an older child. And you can see that this is going to greatly increase greatly increase the amount of dollars available to people at the lower quintiles, right? And so you can see here the before law is the darker blue, and then after the American Rescue Plan, it's the lighter blue, and it's working to raise the incomes of those in the lower 4 quintiles, right? Cap of, I think, 400,000, so it doesn't go to most of the top quintile. But you can see it's really changing the amount of benefits going to those 4 lower quintiles especially. And it's been really forecast to reduce poverty. So we had in the US a National Academy of Sciences panel the last couple of years, on it, reducing child poverty and thinking about what would it look like to make a major investment in the well-being of kids, and what would it take to reduce by half the fraction of kids in poverty. And somewhat by, I think, surprise of many people, this has now happened in terms of current law. And so the child tax credit is only supposed to be a 1-year policy at this point. I think there's hope that it will be extended, but you can see here that these are the projected reductions in poverty rates using our supplemental poverty measure for kids under 18. At the baseline now, we're about 14% using the SPM measure. Unemployment, SNAP is a food stamp benefit. These are the rebates, and then the child tax credit, and all of these policies combined are projected, and this is from the Urban Institute, but there's a number of other estimates out there, and overall they're projected to reduce child poverty by about half, which would be incredibly striking given how long our child poverty rate has been very high. And for those of you who study this, England, earlier, I think 10 or so years ago, also made a major investment in reducing child poverty, and child poverty did go down quite dramatically there. I think it's gone up since. But so policies can matter, right? And policies can make a difference in the resources available to kids. And in my view, there's really two rationales for this, right? I think that every child deserves a fair chance, right? And that can come from Rawls' theory of justice, or a lot of ideas about what's fair and what's an equal opportunity. Because as I've said now a couple of times, not all families are equal in their ability to effectively support and nurture kids, and there's a certain huge random component, right, to what family a kid is born into. And so I think that's one big piece, right, that people often focus on the left politically, thinking about the justice, fairness argument. And in the US, this idea of everyone has a chance and equality of opportunity that, frankly doesn't play out in terms of policy, right, or in terms of how life chances right now. But I think there's a second argument that's not often made, and that's that it's really costly for kids to not reach their potential. So a few years ago, Raj Chetty had a really interesting piece about, he's an economist, at the lost Einsteins, right? And what are we missing out on in terms of inventions, because kids are held back in schools that are not strong and don't nurture their creativity and their, potential genius of inventing new things and bringing new ideas and new products to the marketplace. And that's one very kind of capitalist way of looking at it. And yet you could also think it's inefficient to not have kids being, quote, well raised, whatever you want it to mean, leading to people to be independent workers, voters, citizens, community members, and so forth. And so it seems to me that that's an argument that could be made more, right? It's very expensive to have people that aren't able to kind of reach the potential that they could have. If you think about people going to jail or prison, you could think about welfare costs, lots of things, healthcare needs, things that are not efficient when we can't support people in their younger period to be able to achieve and attain what they could potentially become. So in my view, these arguments have to go kind of in tandem. And some data just came out yesterday. I was excited to see come across Twitter about these are some US attitudes towards some policies. This is done by Harris Public Policy School at the University of Chicago and NORC, National Opinion Research Center, with the AP. And they found, I think, what's kind of striking in the US that you can see here, there's several lines, but the first is that making preschool available to all 4-year-olds, right? Sort of universal preschool. Majority of people favor that. Letting people have parental leave to take time off. Again, the majority favor. Expanding the federal tax credit. Majority favored that. The nurse home visiting program, a little bit lower, but still the majority. And then if you looked at some of the other things, to paying for school vouchers or sending payments directly to families, support is somewhat less. But for many of these things that have been adopted cross-nationally, right, if you think about universal childcare or pre-K, as well as parental leave, the US has moved to a place that the majority actually supports those things that make a lot of sense for families, right, and help kind of smooth out families being able to work and care for kids. And so to me, that's encouraging. And of course, you can look at this report. There's a lot of other data in here, and there's, partisan difference. But many people, even on the right, are saying that these are reasonable national policies. So that gives me some hope that we have now we recognize that there's major inequality, and I think people have recognized that it might be important to finally do something about it. So I've talked for a while. I'll stop there. And I look forward to having questions and comments and hearing what you all have to say about any of this. So thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Marcia Carlson for a fabulous talk. And
thanks, everyone. So fun to see those hands.
and now, shall we go to questions?
Great.
Rachel.
Thank you, Marcy. I really enjoyed the talk. I'd like to ask a kind of specific question about the new American Rescue Plan, because I totally have not been following the details. So the new funding to reduce child poverty, is that going to be like taxable income for families or not? And like, how does that work when, so that's the first question. And then second, like, how does it work when kids are living across households? And then third, like, I've been following Pam Hurd's work a bit on administrative burden. And I know there was some discussion about like, what is easiest to get families these money? And so how was that implemented? And like, and what do we know about how easy it is for these families to actually access it? Because as it kind of seems like some benefits that people are eligible for, they don't actually end up getting.
Yes, that's a big issue in the US. So my understanding about this new tax credit is it's going to be a refundable tax credit, right? So basically, you know, families have a tax liability based on their income. They get up to the max as basically money back if they don't pay taxes or if they pay less in taxes than they would be eligible for with the benefit. So then you ask the question about implementation, right? How does that work? In the US, that's not our strong suit. And so there's, as I understand it, they're now trying to figure that out. And honestly, it's a huge question of whether it will be run through the IRS or the Social Security Administration. And I think many policy scholars think that it should absolutely be run through the Social Security Administration because the IRS is not in the business of giving out benefits. They're in the business of collecting money, right? And it's not the same system. So you will get it as a function of your taxes that were paid, I understand it, in the prior year. And then the actual administration is still being worked out. But this is a big issue, right? Because if families can't get it, what does this mean for those who didn't file taxes last year? What does that mean for those who are, you know, perhaps in jail or prison, in other institutions that don't have a permanent address? I think a lot of that, you know, in my view, this policy kind of was plunked on us in an amazing way that I don't think anyone saw could happen. Like, at least as I heard people talking about this, you know, child allowance or child tax credit, it was like down the road, let's work toward this. You know, now Biden's in office and we'll think about that. And all of a sudden, like, boom, it's in the law. And so I think, I don't know if honestly a lot of those logistics have been worked out yet, at least not that I'm privy to. But yeah, it's a huge question, right? And I think absolutely Pam's and Don's work has highlighted that, you know, just having a policy doesn't mean people actually get what it is intended to do. Or sometimes it includes, you know, challenges or barriers that are kind of probably part of the policy in the sense that, you know, there's not a lot of political will to smooth it out all of the time. So yeah, you raise a really good question.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I wonder if there'll be some evaluation about like who's actually accessing it and whether you can count those people.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've already heard actually a couple of my colleagues are thinking about doing exactly that, right? Who gets it? How is it implemented? How does it change? You know, these are projections of reducing poverty, and I think everyone's very optimistic, but you can only reduce poverty if people actually get the resources. And so I think that understanding the rollout and how it's implemented and for which groups is going to be really, really important.
Yeah.
I think everyone's still just like giddy that, oh my gosh, this happened. So.
Other questions? Yes, Rod.
Yes, thank you. I have much enjoyed your talk too. The first graph I think you gave on the rescue plan, where you had it by quintiles in terms of the child tax benefits that would be there. I saw, of course, that the top quintile is not getting much, but it seems that the four other quintiles are really getting an awful lot. It's not particularly skewed to the poorest, in effect. And that's the child tax benefit is something that can be very easily skewed. I agree that the top people should still be getting some, so it's not just for others. But it seems to me, or am I reading this correctly, that the U.S. plan through this rescue plan is not particularly skewed to the advantage of the poorest.
Yes, to the extent that the poor don't get more in absolute dollars, but to the extent that, you know, $3,600 for one child is a lot for those that are in that very low quintile, right? In relative terms, I think they're getting a higher benefit back. But as I understand it, the impetus here was to try to make it nearly universal. Of course, you know, in Canada, you know more about buy-in of universal programs than we do here, unfortunately, which I look forward to learning more as a society, but sort of having everyone benefit to some extent, minus people that are kind of above, I believe, $400,000 of household income. So the benefits are similar in those quintiles, but of course, the less you have, the more beneficial it is to you as an individual or family. Yeah. Can someone tell me about Canada in this regard? Is there a child allowance, which one of the many things I intended to look up last night. So, Rachel, you're shaking your head.
There is. It's called the Universal Child Care Benefit, and it's been restructured a number of times. Rod is probably the expert on that. I think it had a big change in 2005, and then more recently, Justin Trudeau made it more means tested. So more is going to poorer families and less is going to the top earning families. But yeah, and it comes through, it comes into my bank account every month. I don't know who puts it in, but it just shows up. It might be through the Canadian Revenue Agency. I think you put in money about how much you earned last year, and then that defines your benefits for the next year. Is that correct, Rod?
Yeah, that's right. It's in effect, broadly speaking, Canada has debated questions of guaranteed annual income for a number of years, but we now have guaranteed annual income for the elderly and for the children. For the children, it was originally taken out of the family allowance, which is now administered as a child tax benefit. And yes, contrary to some other programs, I would strongly argue, and the Canadian evidence is there, that administering this through the tax system, it's interesting that Rachel doesn't know where it comes from, but it's administered through the tax system. And so it is cheap to administer. It's through there is the problem of those who don't file taxes, but it's a good reason to push people to file taxes because they will get benefits for these. There's still some who don't, but yeah, it has I think a very good achievement rate in terms of reducing child poverty in Canada and equalizing things for children.
Great, thank you. That's really good to hear. And so it sounds like there's political buy-in to the idea.
Yeah, it's important to keep it universal, and I'm glad that Rachel gets some, so that it's not just for the poor. And I think it should not go to zero. I think that's smart, but the rich shouldn't get very much out of this because it should be skewed, in my view.
Yeah.
And I believe it goes up to 8 when the kids are 16. Is that right, Rod?
Yeah.
There were so many hands up earlier, and now I don't see any.
Any questions? Yes, Anna.
This was really interesting, such a beautiful overview. I actually don't have a question, that's just why I didn't want to speak up, but I was so heartened and happy to see that there's something good happening, because, you know, studying life expectancy and health is just bad news all around. And so to see that there is a potential for having the childhood poverty rate was just amazing. So thank you.
Thanks, Anna. That's so nice. Yeah, I think that's how many of us feel here. Like, oh my goodness, the U.S. might actually do something. How did this happen? It's great. Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, because there's been a lot of, for those of you who might or might not know about U.S. welfare policy, there's been a lot of history, right, of like very modest amounts of payments. Then during the first Bush administration, George W. Bush, sorry, second Bush, there was an effort to try to increase marriage, which didn't, you know, many people had concerns about what does that mean, and that didn't work anyway. And so there's been a lot of, you know, debate over the years about how best to do this, and it seems like, well, giving families money is good for kids and good for family stability. So it seems like there's at least some consensus around that, and I can't wait to see the studies that come out of this. And there's a couple other studies being run now by U.S. colleagues. There's one called Baby's First Years, of giving a lot of money to mothers of young kids to see how does just having resources, right, and not be struggling to survive and put food on the table, how does that benefit families and kids? And it seems very obvious, but in the U.S. we've had a hard time implementing that. So I think, thank you, Anna. I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful. It's a good moment in our little.
Rod, did you have your hand up earlier?
Yes, going back to your statistics on non-marital births, if I was to propose how to state these things, I would start by whether the birth occurs in a union or not, and among those in union, to separate out those who are in marital unions, and because it seems to me that there's quite a difference across there. In Quebec, they have even more data. They have those on which they were married, those on which they were cohabiting, and then those who were the father is declared on the birth certificate, and the one where the father is not even declared on the birth certificate. So those four categories, and especially in the bottom one, is where you have the most disadvantage. Of course, it is steep all the way through, but I think that especially in Quebec, where there's so few births are now occurring in marriages, there's a push in Canada to focus on families, regardless if they're cohabiting or married, in terms of the parents. And to start with that, yes, I would think that that's a better, because if you lump all the non-married together, you've got all those what I call three different kinds there, which are really very different among themselves.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think in the US, we have quite a bit more instability even among our cohabitors. So there's one big study that Kate's also familiar with, the Fragile Family Study, and of the unmarried births, about half of them were living together at the time of the birth. But of that half, the vast majority of them break up by the time the child is older. So I think on the cross-national data I show is about 3/4 of the cohabitors' parents break up. And so I think your point is really well taken. I think in the US, we don't have the same kind of cohabitation that in Canada or in Quebec you have, those in that province have, and in some of the European countries. And so I remember a few years ago, I presented some of this work in France. And again, I was using US data and talking about marriage, and people were so angry. They're like, who cares about marriage? It's just about being partnered. And, you know, I agree in concept. And if we had more stable partnerships, I think we would have more of that middle group. At least historically, though, the US, there's a lot of dissolution that happens quickly. And I think another interesting thing that I didn't have a slide here, it's another talk, is thinking about of unmarried parents. And this is true of both the cohabitors and those where the mom isn't living with the biological father of the child. The vast majority of those births are occurring, it's not a first birth. And so they're occurring when there's already been a child by another partner. And then sometimes those parents will break up and repartner again. So you have a lot more complexity, at least in the United States, among unmarried parents. And I think that's a little bit less true of cohabitors, but the bigger difference is between those that are married at the birth versus those who aren't married. And there's less of a difference among the unmarrieds between the cohabitors and those who aren't living with the partner. So I think your point is really well taken. I think the US, there's just, you know, as I showed, the fraction of the unmarried births that occur to very highly educated people are so low. So it tends to be, that's a really big differentiating factor, is the non-marital birth as linked to education and linked to instability in a lot of things. But I take your point. I think it's a very good point. I could be more cautious on how I.
Yes, Rachel.
So a few times in your talk, you mentioned that the policies or the data don't really cover kids who are parented across households. And this is something I was talking to Mikko Mirskala about the other day, because we were talking about how these kids would be measured in different kinds of data sets. And so he was telling me that in Finland, all kids have a permanent address, like where they're registered. And then there's data in the register data for like what proportion of their time they spend in different households. So like, you know, there can be a kid who is registered with a mother or a father, but spends, you know, any percentage of their time in the other household. And I was like, oh, wow, that's so interesting. So in Canadian tax data, like I've looked at this, and we have data on kids that that you're filing for as a dependent in the tax data, right? So in couples where like one parent is filing for the kid 1 year and then the next parent the next year to get a deduction, like it would look like that you have a child in your household every other year,
right?
When like actually that's not the case. And so I wondered if you knew about how different data sources and studies are handling this issue, which is you know, an increasing proportion of kids, you know, as kids
Mhm.
aren't just like by default living with their moms when parents divorce anymore. So what do you know or think about this?
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue, and I think the U.S. does a terrible job at measuring it. So I've got a project with a couple of colleagues here looking at shared physical custody, right, which is that, you know, so we don't have measures of co-parenting, but we have a measure of when they say that the order that came out of a divorce, and in this case they are legal marriages that are ending, whether that's shared across two parents. And so we have this very kind of crude measure in the current population survey child support supplement. And we do find this kind of increase over time. I think it's the latest data is about 20-some% of parents that are getting divorced are saying that it's a shared custody situation. But we have very poor data on what does that actually look like? What does that mean? How much time in different households? Like, I'm trying to think, I don't know of really any study that does that very well. You know, there's measures of when the kid lives with one parent, usually the mom still here, and how much time they see that non-resident dad, but I don't think we have very good measures at all. There's a few, in fragile families, there's a few measures of like overnights that you might have, but taking the kind of holistic perspective on shared parenting, I think we do a terrible job at that. And we're really misrepresenting, I think, what's happening in a lot of families, and especially families that, you know, have the resources to navigate that, right? So I know in Belgium, I gave a talk there a few years ago, and I was amazed that their law is something to the effect of you're expected to have, when parents split up, you're expected to have live nearby each other and to have a room for the kid in both parents' houses, right? And obviously that requires a certain amount of resources, right? To then, you know, you lost economies of scale, you have two separate homes and so forth. But I think in the US, it's just we don't have very good data. So there's been some evidence, like in some folks at Wisconsin actually have looked at the court record data coming out of, you know, the legal system, and you can kind of pull that data together, and they found a huge increase in shared custody in this one particular state. But at the national level and in most of our studies, it's really household based, and so we don't think about, you know, the question, the way you talked about it in Finland, right? You have an address and then you think about who's splitting their time, and then it's even worse for policy because you have to declare who has custody of the kid, and that's a 0-1. So you can't, like the earned income tax credit, you can't share across parents. So it's interesting in Canada that you can alternate. I mean, maybe people do that here. I haven't seen that be measured or talked about. So I'm curious.
So you can alternate, and you can also share the universal childcare benefit. So people,
really? Okay.
Yeah. So the Canadian Revenue Agency allows people to do that, which is kind of neat.
So you put that on your tax form of, do you give a percentage, or it's just split in two, or how does that work?
I think it's like, I can't remember the categories, but it's like mostly one parent, mostly the other parent, or like pretty shared. I think maybe it's between 40 and 60% of time is in this mostly shared. There are some questions about this in the most recent Canadian General Social Survey in 2017. And it shows that, like, I think it's like about almost half of kids are living like across households mostly equally. But then when you like disaggregate like the male and female respondents, like men say that they see kids more than women say that the kids see the partner, and it's not the same partners, right? But there's like some reporting differences that are a little bit questionable. But anyway, I think it's like a really important question for family researchers moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think A, measuring the phenomenon, step one, and then B, thinking about what would policy look like to support that. And so I really think in the US, it's all 0-1. So even like the food stamp, like the unit, you're supposed to think about who you're sharing food with, who do you share a kitchen with, and then you can draw food stamps based on that unit. But what if kids are going back and forth, if they're 5 nights a week in one house and weekends with the other parent? Or it's just, you can't divide those things up very well.
Right. So maybe each parent could just apply for food stamps and say that the kids are there, right?
Yeah, I don't think you can. I mean, I think there's that sort of the double dipping, I don't think can work very well. I don't know the logistics of it, but that doesn't seem like it happens very commonly.
I see.
Because I think you have to give a kid name who you have custody or, you know, you're sharing with, and that like some of the time category isn't really an option.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So, as I understand the food stamp. SNAP program here?
Well, apparently some benefits you have to list the other people involved, but then the government like never checks if people are drawing on the same benefits. So someone who works in the government under parental benefits told me once that like, let's say that I am applying for parental benefits and then the father of my child is applying.
Mm-hmm.
We both put the child's name or number, but we live in different households. No one actually checks like
Oh, interesting.
whether the total number of benefits like add up, that basically that other partner could, you know, ask for more than, together we could ask for more than 100%, and like they're just not going to go after that. They just don't have the staff.
Okay.
And they're just like not linking data across households, at least a couple years ago when they told me they weren't.
That's
I wonder,
fascinating.
like if that's the case for food stamps too. Like it would take a lot of effort to link all those data across households to actually check, right? Like,
right. Yeah, no, that's actually a good point.
give people money.
Right. Yeah.
Especially if it's for food stamps, like that's not a very expensive program.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. In the US, I feel like they tend to find a way to go after the least advantaged people in ways that are make no sense, right? Go after the billionaires.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? So, yes, Pat.
I would be interested in your view as to the extent to which you feel that there is support in the population for continuing this boost in the child tax benefits once we get beyond the rescue plan.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that it's been pretty popular. The idea has been pretty popular among those who, especially among those who are parents. And I think the hope is that once, you know, I think that was also part of the idea of giving it pretty high up the income distribution, is that once families get those resources, they will like having those resources. And so I think that, you know, there have been some opinion polls about it, but it also felt very distant, I think, for the US. And so I don't know, I think that in general, the hope, at least among the kind of people in favor of reducing child poverty and of giving these, is that once it's in people's pockets, they're going to really appreciate it and hopefully begin to see children a little bit different, right? I think if you think about supporting kids as a society and about the benefit of that for all of us, I think, and along with then feeling like you have more resources yourself, I think the hope is very much that it will be popular. It'd be in a way hard to see it not be popular, except among the very, you know, far right perhaps, or people that have resources and don't need it. But I don't know, are there opinion polls in Canada that show how much it's appreciated?
I can't think of anything right now, no.
So Patrick had his hand up, and then afterwards, Vicky.
That's actually related to my question. I was struck by the data you showed about the pretty widespread approval of some of these child poverty reducing measures. So part of my question was a little bit about whether the present COVID situation was making people more willing and sort of highlighting the urgency of some of those measures, plus coming, you know, not that far into the past, coming off of the Great Recession. So these, like the urgency being kind of a driver of that approval. But also I was wondering to what extent you thought maybe the sort of increasing complexity of families was kind of a leading indicator of approval for these, not just child poverty reduction measures, but family support policies more generally, right? Because if respondents of these public opinion surveys are either more likely themselves to be part of more complex families or are more likely to know people in these complex families, then I don't know, perhaps they're more understanding or more approving of, you know, the need to support all families. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, I mean, I guess I would say two things. I think you're absolutely right? So I think as, you know, for example, as divorce rates went up, I think there was a lot less kind of stigma around divorce or surprise around divorce. And it was kind of like, okay, people do family as they do family, and let's see how we can support families as best we can. And so I do think the same thing is probably happening with more complex families, right? It's not uncommon, back in the days when we could fly in an airplane, you sit next to someone and they're like, oh, what do? You start chatting about families, and then you're like, oh, I'm going to visit my, step granddaughter's boyfriend, something that's like, okay, there's a lot of complexity about sort of how we go about our lives. And I think that seeing like all families as worthy of support, in my view, at least, as there's been more variety, I think that's come into play. And I think absolutely the pandemic probably does make people, certainly there's been a ton of job loss, there's been a ton of layoffs, there's been a lot of, especially people in certain industries and occupations not able to, keep up in terms of their own earnings. So no question, I think that would affect the sense of like, okay, we need some relief, right? It's not called the American Rescue Plan for nothing. Like, it really felt like, okay, SOS, there's a huge problem here. And the fact that the child allowance, I think, is part of that was, I think, a pleasant surprise. And obviously those of you who study kind of history, like after the Great Depression, there was a lot of policies enacted, in part because it felt like, oh, this isn't just like, people that don't work hard enough or are lazy. This is like affecting all of us, right, in some form or fashion. And so I do think these moments of kind of exogenous shocks to our whole system, not only as a country, as a globe, I think we begin, at least in my maybe naive Pollyanna view, begin to think, oh, we're a little bit more empathetic toward our fellow human being because bad stuff is happening all around us, even to, those that we know and love. It's not just kind of quote other people out there. So I would like to think you're absolutely right on both of those regards. So I guess it will be over time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
If you could comment a little bit more, on potentially the universal child care in Canada, in terms of, potential effects on family structure and demographics.
So talking about universal childcare affecting family demographics?
Yes, like on the platform of the Liberal Party, there's ideas of implementing, free or almost free childcare in every province, like we have in Quebec. What would that change the family structure, or would that, do you think that people will have more children?
Oh, I see. Is it pronatalist? I mean, I don't know about Canada specific. I'm sure others of you that are on this call, Rachel, I'm looking at you, might have a better guess or a sense of that. My sense of most policies that are put in place in the hopes of increasing people's fertility don't end up increasing fertility rates. I mean, there's, to the extent that you can have policies that better allow people to have both be in the market, labor market, and have kids, that tends to provide a positive context for childbearing and for families, and might kind of at the margin increase childbearing, but I don't think these tend to have a really dramatic effect on fertility rates. But others that know the Canadian system should chime in here.
Thank you.
You should answer this question.
No, I'm not prepared to give a proper answer at this point. Thank you.
Rachel, what would you say, or Kate?
So my sense from the research on the highly subsidized childcare in Quebec is that it affected fertility very, very little, if at all, but it did increase women's labor force participation very much. So, women have about like 85% of women are in the labor force in Quebec, which is like basically the highest in the world. So I think that the Liberals' policy about making childcare more affordable is less about helping people have more kids and about making life easier and more affordable for those with whatever number of kids they have. That's my general answer. Rod, do you approve of that answer?
Yes, that's true. Those are the broad terms to start with.
Yeah.
Vicky had her hand up. Vicky?
I guess I don't want to be the anti-positive view, but I'm just wondering how you think race and framing might fit into this, and whether, you can imagine people framing child benefits in a pretty negative way and, you know, associating it with race if they want to. And, you know, occasionally here we hear people saying, you know, these refugees coming in, they have, you know, 10 kids and they get all these benefits, and there's some, you know, negative angle on it. So I just wondered whether you thought that how that might play out in the US in terms of race and, you know, the view that maybe undocumented or new immigrants might have lots of kids or something.
Yeah, and you know, it's a good question because we have, as you might notice, a persistent issue around race and inequality and concerns about that and how people of color are treated. You know, that's really been, I think, a tragic thing that's come very clear in the last couple of years, but it didn't just start in the last years, right? So there's huge inequalities, there's huge issues around framing of social benefits and who qualifies for things. So your point is very well taken. I think the beauty of some of these policies that are now part of this new bill is that they're not means tested very much, right? And so they're really going to families, you know, almost across the income distribution except for the very top. And I think trying to think about them as supporting all families, not supporting poor families, right, I think is really I think the plus, there's a huge plus of this particular policy. So it's been interesting. I've read a lot of stories about these policies. There's been very little, I mean, there's been talk about how they will help people, including families of color, African Americans and immigrants. There's been very little sort of frustration around that or sort of parsing out along those lines, I think because of the way the policies are structured. So we'll see. I mean, I feel like there's other policies where that's happening a lot more. I think the hope is that this is closer to universal and takes away those arguments. At the same time, it will disproportionately benefit those who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, which, as we know, are often racial and ethnic minorities. And so I think it's a very positive implementation of something that will absolutely benefit those groups kind of more given their relative disadvantage, and yet it's not been framed around that in any way. But you're right to be skeptical. I mean, we have a history of not doing that well, so.
Any other comments? So on that wonderful note, please join me in thanking Professor Carlson for a wonderful talk and a wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure. Kate, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all. It's great to talk with you. I really, really enjoyed it.
It was such a
Thank you.